Hello.
Great. So it looks like we have everybody coming into the room. Fantastic. Excellent. Might just ease into the panel to give people a couple more minutes to be joining us here. But great, it looks like we're getting an excellent turnout, which I think is credit to it speaks to the importance of the topic, but also the great panel of speakers that we have to hear from today. I'm going to share my screen then and get us going. Okay, folks, you can all see my slides. Is that right? Excellent. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. It's actually the very first panel of ISSA 2020, I think. So that's the annual meeting of the International Sociology of Sport Association. We have a most exciting panel of speakers ready to discuss the consequences of COVID-19 for women's sport. All of our speakers are leading sports scholars, leading gender scholars, leading feminist scholars, and their careers and work to date have truly advanced how we understand the workings of gender inequality within sport. I want to thank Dr. Lucy Shaw, who's an ISSA board member and assistant professor at the Institute of Sport Sciences at the University of Lausanne, who organised this panel and gave me the opportunity to moderate. Well done, Lucy, on bridging multiple time zones. My name is Madeline Pape. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Lausanne. I'm a sociologist of gender. I got my PhD at UW-Madison last year, 2019. And I am also an Australian Olympian in the sport of track and field. So I'm very much engaged and interested in the advancement of women's sport in various parts of the world. And part of the reason that I'm moderating this panel today is that I recently co-authored an article with one of our panelists, Fiona McLaughlin, which was published in the International Journal of Sport Communication. And we really were looking at this concept of dependence, the gendered concept of dependence, how it's been wielded against women's sport, including during the current COVID moment, while the many social and financial investments upon which men's sport depends have been all but obscured. And it's really this question of how the pandemic is intersecting with and reconfiguring the existing gender dynamics in sport that is motivating our panel today. I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists in just a moment, but before I do, I'll make just a couple of logistical points. Please ensure that you have yourself muted. Please make use of the chat box. If you have a question for one or all of our panelists, you can post it in the chat box at any time. Lucy will be monitoring your questions and will be helping me to bring them to the attention of our panelists during the Q&A. So to repeat, we'll be fielding questions via the chat box. And finally, I just want to make a note that all of the sessions during ISSA 2020 are going to be recorded so that they can be shared on the ISSA YouTube channel. So that's to allow people who have other obligations or a time zone challenged to view the sessions at their own convenience. So just be aware that by joining our online event, you are consenting to being recorded. Having said that, I think for most of us, we're not going to be really captured by the recording anyway, since, with Zoom, we can't see everyone on the screen at the one time. Okay, so it is with great pleasure that I introduce our speakers. Today we're joined by Cheryl Kuki, Professor of Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies and American Studies at Purdue University. Professor Kuki is past president of the North American Society for the Sociology of Sport. She's an associate editor of Sociology of Sport Journal and is a preeminent scholar in the study of gender and sports media and communication, and has really produced a number of the field-defining journal articles in this area, in leading journals in gender, feminist and sports studies. And Cheryl's also published the book No Slam Dunk, with Michael Mesner, analysing how the progress toward gender equity in sports is far from complete. So very pertinent to our discussion today. Welcome, Cheryl. We're also joined by Dr. Nicole Lavoie, Director of the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport and Senior Lecturer at the School of Kinesiology at the University of Minnesota. Nicole is one of those rare people whose work bridges the academy and sports practice, having published both in leading journals like Gender and Society, Sex Roles, as well as endless book chapters, and her own book, Women in Sports Coaching, and has also produced an enormous amount of engaged research that has truly advanced public awareness and policy debates surrounding women in sport. Especially the issue of women in sports coaching. And recently, actually, Nicole published a piece in The Conversation with Sarah Lieberman and Sally Shaw, urging the powers that be in sports governance to use the COVID moment as an opportunity to put women's sport and gender equity front and centre. So again, very pertinent to our conversation today. Next, I'll introduce Fiona McLaughlin, Senior Lecturer in the College of Sport and Exercise Science at Victoria University. I've already mentioned our collaboration with regard to the current COVID moment, but Fiona is much better known for her own influential historical work examining precisely how the pursuit of gender equity in sport has been thwarted at key moments in time, and how quickly this past becomes obscured or forgotten. And so Fiona has really worked on this concept of progress narratives in women's sport, in which we fail to recognise how and why history is repeating itself. So a very critical perspective and important perspective to bear on the current COVID moment, particularly given the optimism that has surrounded various professional women's sporting codes in recent years. And Fiona also has an invaluable applied perspective given the various collaborations with sports governing bodies and grassroots sports that she's currently engaged in. And last, for alphabetical reasons only, we're joined by yet another outstanding superstar status scholar in the field of gender and sport, Professor Holly Thorpe from the School of Health at the University of Waikato. So Holly's work has truly pushed the boundaries of women in sports scholarship, both substantively and theoretically. She's made groundbreaking contributions in the area of gender and action sports, sport and conflict, women's health and sport, as well as a great deal of innovative work expanding theories of embodiment and feminist new materialisms. And in addition to a very long list of sole and co-authored books, edited volumes and journal articles, Holly has worked closely with numerous sports governing bodies, and her expertise has been sought out by the International Olympic Committee, High Performance Sport New Zealand, and Sport New Zealand. So welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for giving us your time and expertise today. Here is our agenda of questions. And I'll read these aloud as we go, but our plan is to get each of your thoughts on one question at a time, and then we'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. So I will stop my screen share. So we had our first question that Lucy and I posed was, how is the coronavirus pandemic affecting women's sport in different parts of the world and at different levels? And perhaps, Cheryl, I'll ask you to respond first.
Great, thank you. Thank you again to ISSA for organizing this panel discussion, for inviting me to be a part of it. Maddie, I appreciate your working with me in terms of this day and what we would be talking about, and the time that you invested in organizing this, as well as the generous introduction. So thank you. And thank you to everyone who's here. It's so good to see some familiar faces. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you all are. So I think I want to get the conversation started with maybe sort of situating myself and where I'm going to be speaking from. I am a scholar who is based in the United States. My research and expertise focuses primarily on women's sports in the United States, although I've looked at other contexts as well. But I think for the comments today, I'm really going to be speaking about the US context. And given that, I think that an important piece in answering this question about COVID and how it's affecting women's sports, specifically in the US, having that conversation outside of the larger context in the United States, where we have seen a tremendous uprisings with respect to human rights concerns in the United States around police brutality and systematic racism and racial injustice in the country. And so one of the things that I think is important, and I understand that there's going to be another panel on this, so I don't want to spend too much time focusing my remarks, but what I've seen is that this has created a space in the United States and elsewhere as well. To the pandemic itself has created a space for us to mobilize and to really amplify the social justice movements that have been sort of ongoing, the recent social justice movements that have been ongoing for the last couple of years. And certainly the Women's National Basketball Association, the Professional Women's Basketball League here in the United States, has been at the forefront of some of those advocacy and activism efforts. Typically, we hear a lot about what's happening in the world of men's sports, the NBA and the NFL in particular, because they dominate so much of the media landscape. But I wanted to just acknowledge the way that the pandemic has really, I think, provided a space to open up and to draw more attention and visibility to social justice movements in the United States. I think that in this sense, the pandemic opened up other opportunities for activism. There's a hashtag movement that came about in part, I think, because athletes were taking a pause with respect to competition and training. And this gave a lot of athletes time to reflect, not only just what was happening in the United States with respect to race and social movements, but also what was happening internally with respect to their organizations, their experiences. And so there was a hashtag that was started by gymnasts about the abuse and harassment that they encountered, and that particular hashtag movement went global. And so we saw that kind of opening up a space for other points of reflection and engagement with social justice issues. I'm not sure how much more time I have, but I think we could talk a little bit about within the United States context. I'm guessing maybe Professor Lavoie will speak to this as well. The ways in which in the United States, if we're looking at collegiate sports, and this is something that I think is unique to the US, that the pandemic unfortunately opened up opportunities for universities and colleges to make significant cuts to funding to women's sports programs, into women's sports opportunities. There's a number of universities, Stanford, the University of Iowa, the University of Minnesota, Brown University, Stanford, did I already say Stanford University? There's maybe one or two others that have made significant cuts to women's sports or women's sports opportunities, and used the COVID pandemic and the overall budget cuts that universities are facing as a result to declines in individual state expenditures that are directed towards universities to support higher education, as well as declines in enrollment, which are placing strain on revenues with respect to tuition dollars and monies. What's interesting about some of these cases, and I think this was from an article Christine Brennan wrote in USA Today, is when you look at the cost savings that are precipitated by these cuts, what we see is that the cuts only save athletic departments roughly $1 million annually. For those of you that are not aware of the United States college sports context, $1 million might sound like quite a bit of money. But when we look at, for example, at some of these schools, the college men's football coach or men's basketball coach is making multi-million dollars a year. And so, for example, at the University of Iowa, where they cut for women's sports, the coach signed a 10-year contract in 2010 for $42 million. So essentially making $4.2 million a year. The cost savings in cutting women's sports was $900,000 annually. Could the football coach maybe accept a 25% pay cut? Clearly, it was easier to cut women's sports. And so there's concerns among women's sports advocates here in the United States about the ways in which the pandemic is being used as a kind of a leveraging point to make other cuts. I can also talk a bit more about how that trickles down into the high school and youth sport context. but I also want to give time for my other panelists to address this issue as well.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'll note that down for later in the conversation to make sure we don't lose that. Nicole, maybe did you want to respond or offer your thoughts to this question, given you're also in the US context?
Yeah, I can build on what Dr. Cookie said, and I think I want to sort of again thank everybody for being here, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel with my esteemed colleagues. It's always fun to be on a panel together, but I also want to frame that my comments on this panel today will really reflect some of the collaborative work that I've been doing with colleagues around the world, and their names, I don't know if you can see that, are on the screen behind me. One of the things that I'm very privileged to do in the Tucker Center is work with amazing scholars like the women on this panel and some of you listening today, to try to make a difference in the lives of girls and women in sport. And so I would be remiss if I didn't note that some of these thoughts are my own, but some of this reflects some work that I've been doing with them across the spectrum around the globe. So I will say that we know that COVID has affected women's sport across every sphere: health, economic, political, personal, security and safety, and these impacts on women have been exacerbated. Girls and women in sport have always faced challenges, but COVID and the pandemic have really brought to light that their lived experiences are embedded within a system of patriarchy and male dominance. And that has resulted in inequality, inequity, discrimination, neglect, oppression, intersectional identity oppression, erasure, silence, invisibility, objectification, oh my, right? There's a lot that we could unpack there. And COVID has really exposed and illuminated those disparities and highlighted the enduring gendered systemic problems that women and girls have faced. And Dr. Cookie is right in that our college, some of our intercollegiate institutions around the country are taking this opportunity to cut men's and women's teams. And there's a database that's ongoing. It's called the COVID Tracker. And currently, I just looked at it right before this, is that we've had 147 women's teams cut and 150 men's teams cut at all different levels of competition for college athletics, and we're not done yet. So I think, however, with all of that I just framed, I also want to say that COVID has provided opportunity and hope. And I think oftentimes we don't look there. So as a critical feminist scholar, we always like to critique and draw out the problems. But I think I want to take a little different pivot here. A couple things that are important. So first of all, the pandemic has offered an opportunity for women to be creative and be entrepreneurial with female athletes in ways that we have not seen before. Second, female athletes and those that market and promote women's sport have taken the opportunity to use social and digital platforms when there was no live mainstream sport. And as people tuned in to digital platforms to kind of maintain a sense of connection and community, the opportunity arose to kind of rethink traditional media models established by men's sport. So that's another opportunity. Third, it's allowed us an opportunity to witness how easily women's professional sports can flourish and grow with minimal additional investment. So that's really been highlighted. Fourth, this crisis has forced all of us and those in women's sport to reevaluate and focus on what really matters. What are our core values? And women's sport, women's professional sport in particular, many of which have strong core values, and Dr. Cookie mentioned the WNBA, this provides an avenue for corporate activism and authenticity and untapped consumers at an affordable economic value compared to men's sport. The pandemic's brought that to light. And lastly, it's offered a chance for decision makers to change the dominant narratives around women's sport. The data doesn't bear out that no one's interested in women's sport. We have retail sales, digital and social engagement, viewership. And those that are working in women's sport have always done the hard work over time. And many of you are on this call right now. So we've built and marketed and run our sports teams and programs and initiatives with limited resources and funding, which is a problem. However, this might also be an opportunity in compared to the inflated cost of men's sport. So I want to offer a little bit of hope in this framework of why COVID matters to women in women's sport.
Thank you. And so, Dr. McLaughlin, I might ask you to chime in with your thoughts from Melbourne, Australia.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you to my two previous speakers. Unfortunately, my take on this first question is a downer after Nicole's nice, hopeful window there. How I approached this question, Maddie and I, when we wrote the paper that she mentioned before, it was about April or May, and we were speculating on what some of the effects might be. We hadn't yet seen how they would be borne out. We anticipated that we would see some negative effects in professional sport, in leadership, and in media, and also in grassroots participation. It's only been a few months and I've been stuck in the house since then, so I haven't been able to do too much of my own research on those areas, but we've got some fantastic postgraduate students at the moment working in different sport contexts, so I thought I'd just provide some insights from some of their work in order to sort of give a little bit of some examples of what's happening in Australia. So if we start with the professional or the elite level, Susanna Strinder has been working on an ethnographic study of professional women's cycling. That's been an ongoing, so that's sort of a 3-year project. She's coming to the end of that now, but is still really in touch with that context. And so obviously there's been cancellation of races and shifting of those events. The main concerns in that context, economic strain on sponsors. People have already pulled out in terms of their contracts, backing down from sponsor deal promises. And in her work, she's really mapped out the precarious business model of cycling, and these teams that rely on very few sponsors, and this is proven that it's very not very sustainable at all. During the time, several riders have come forward with their actual struggles of the pandemic, lockdowns, quarantines, and actually there's evidence that several of those have decided that they're leaving the sport. So an already difficult sport to take up as a professional elite athlete. You add these barriers in and we're seeing people leaving the sport. Also, the unfortunate thing with this cycling context is after decades of financial issues and alleged exploitation within the cycling circles, 2020 was supposed to be an amazing year for women's cycling. So it's the first year that the UCI introduced a minimum wage and other benefits for the top teams. 2021 was supposed to step that up in terms of wages and benefits. And unfortunately now with the uncertainty, the financial blow that's been suffered by teams and sponsors, it's all up in the air. So that's enlisted in one example in the professional context where we have cause for concern. In terms of leadership and administration, here I'll draw on a master's research project being conducted by Lisa Limry on cricket. Cricket in Australia is actually probably one of the highlights in terms of women's sport at the moment. They were doing some very good things in terms of equality and also fandom. However, within this context, COVID has already directly resulted in the redundancy of a head of female engagement at Cricket Australia. Cricket Victoria, so within a state, has removed their female participation specialist role, and also one of their only 2 female regional managers. An annual Youth Premier League cricket competition, which is a setting where female coaches are recruited for girls' teams. So it's like the only representative level coaching experience available for these women has been cancelled. And ultimately the loss of these roles and opportunities not only shift the focus away from female participation, but these are all women leaders in their own right. So the number of female leaders as role models within the sport has already been negatively impacted by this in such a short space of time, since Maddie and I were speculating a few months ago. The other major issue in terms of grassroots participation, so colleagues at VU, so Brent McDonald, Carla Luguetti and Gabby Garton and I are working on a collaborative project with Football Victoria, so with soccer. They're doing some fantastic things as well. They've put out a goal to reach 50-50 by 2027 in all levels of soccer. So basically, putting out the gender equality goal. We're working with clubs at the moment on that goal, but we've found in terms of COVID, the biggest concern of the lockdowns and missed seasons is in the junior girls area. They've made great gains in the last sort of 5 years in terms of recruiting girls to the sport. Those girls in that pivotal age group of 12 to 14, there's really real concern there without a year of those really awesome physical, social experiences through sport that they're not actually going to return. Thinking about, we were speculating and I'm pretty concerned at all those levels. As you know from the introduction, I'm really interested in history, which I see as basically the politics of time. We know that when it comes to sport, women's time is not prioritised. So in events, media, club schedules, and in families. And for me, this is the biggest issue, how sport organisations, governing bodies, media, clubs, and individual families respond in the face of additional barriers. And I'll talk a little bit more about time and that in the subsequent questions.
Thanks, Fee. Thanks for finishing that up. Holly, can I pass it over to you and get your thoughts from New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. Kia ora, everyone. It's really nice to be here. Great to be here. I will, thanks to everyone for being here. It's an honour to be speaking here from Aotearoa, New Zealand today. And this is a topic, how the COVID pandemic has affected women in sport. This is a topic that's been consuming me probably for the last almost 10 months, I guess. And this is, I just finished a 4-year project looking at the role of physical activity in informal sports in post-disaster and conflict zones. And so I've been seeing some interesting kind of similarities and differences in the role of physical activity and formal activities for people sort of coping, their creativity in terms of supporting themselves and each other. So building upon that with a very different kind of focus, over the past 6 months I've been involved in 3 quite different projects that have been focused on the gendered politics of recovery. And in each of these projects I've been working to bring an interdisciplinary feminist perspective to understand the challenges for women in navigating time, space and resources for sport and exercise at different stages during the COVID-19 recovery response. So I want to now just share a few little initial insights and findings from 2 of these projects. The first was an international survey that was done in June with my feminist sports scientist colleague, Dr. Stacey Sims. And this was very much focused on sort of mapping out this unique moment in time. So it was an international survey. We had over 12,000 respondents from around the world. Many of them, or over 60% of them, were competitive athletes, but the rest were sort of recreational exercises. We were really interested in, most of them actually had been, like over 90% had been in various forms of shelter in place or lockdown for at least 4 weeks at the time of the survey. And we were really interested in how these sort of restricted movements in both public and outdoor spaces was affecting women's training and their physical activity experiences in their everyday lives. So more than 60% of them said that COVID was affecting their motivation to engage in physical activity, and 45% of them had reported sort of a reduction in their training hours. They talked about digital technologies being really important in both maintaining their fitness and training practices, but also connecting with others, with their peers, with their friends, with their fellow athletes. And this actually built upon some of the work I've been doing with Kim Toffeletti, Rebecca Olive, who I think is on the call today, hi Beck, and Adele Pavlidis around the importance of digital technologies for women in times of COVID. 50% of the respondents said they were feeling new forms of body image pressures related to concerns about putting on weight. That was about 78% of that 50%. Worries of losing muscle tone, worries of losing the look of an athlete. Over 50% had new performance-related pressures and stresses. There were a whole lot more kind of new nutritional and dietary changes. 23% reported menstrual changes because of new stresses, new diet, new training practices, major disruption to the everyday routines, and that's what they put it down to. Over 97% said that the outdoors and getting outdoors and doing physical activity was really, really important for their coping during this really stressful time. Some of the biggest stresses were the health of others. That was a major concern, as long as managing work alongside other responsibilities, financial worries, relationship tensions within families, and health concerns for themselves. The women had a number of worries about returning to training after shelter-in-place restrictions, and particularly concerns about going back to busy public spaces like gyms. And over 50% said they were really worried about the state of their sport after shelter-in-place restrictions eased. So clearly it was a very stressful and disruptive time for women who are participating in sport at a range of levels. And we recognise that surveys, like any method, have strengths and limitations. And for us, it was just a sort of a mapping exercise to see what was going on for women at this time. Then we could build upon this research with more qualitative, in-depth and more creative methods. So this is a sort of an international snapshot here. And then another project I've been involved in is a more New Zealand focused project. And this has been with a couple of my ex-PhD students, Dr. Nita Ahmed and Dr. Alison Jeffries, and also 2 colleagues in Australia, Dr. Adele Pavlidis and Professor Simone Fulliger. But in the New Zealand version of this project, we're really interested in the economic and emotional recoveries of women who are either paid athletes or women who work in the sport and fitness sector. So really interested in those women who have had their livelihoods radically disrupted. Because we've seen in New Zealand the real gendered effect of the economic impacts of COVID. So 90% of the 11,000 jobs in New Zealand lost because of COVID were women's jobs. And we're seeing that in sport too. And so this project is including interviews with female athletes, as well as, those women who own CrossFit gyms or yoga studios or are personal trainers, for example. And already it's early stages of this project, but we're seeing some initial themes coming through. And yes, these women are incredibly stressed, but they're also being really creative and resourceful and trying to provide support to their communities of physical culture. And so we're seeing some real communities of care emerging, some very creative strategies being developed by these women to support their communities. But this is also taking a huge sort of emotional and economic toll on some of the women. And what we're seeing is some real concerns about the sense of future. It's so uncertain. And also, importantly, that these struggles and these strategies of these women, these creative strategies, are not universal, and they're being felt unevenly by women in different socioeconomic and sociocultural situations. So many of the women talk about new reflections, new learnings through these experiences, but also this deep fatigue that's coming through. And we've been connecting with some of the work of Rosie Braidotti around shared exhaustion, which seems to be something that many women in sport, but in their everyday lives, are experiencing at this time.
Thanks, Holly. So I'm glad we're getting such a really a really broad spread here of perspectives on different levels of sport, women involved at different levels and in different roles, and also the balance of optimism alongside some accounts of the challenges that women in different parts of sport and physical activity are facing. The next question that we had suggested to our panelists was the question of what the current COVID moment is revealing to us about women's place in sport, and what we can say about any progress that has been achieved in recent years. Fiona, I know this is the question of progress is one that is very much at the heart of your work, so I might ask you to respond to that first. Then I have to figure out how to unmute you, but I think we're good now. Okay.
Okay. Sweet. Okay. Thanks, Maddie. Yeah, so this is really a really interesting one for me. For the past 4 years or so, at least in the media, Australia's been said to be in a boom time for women's sport. So we've seen new professional leagues, greater visibility of successful teams like the Matildas, really big surge in women's cricket, number of state level initiatives, particularly in Victoria, to grow women's sport and support female leaders. Right, so fantastic, optimistic time, great time to be alive. So within that context, as Madeline mentioned in my intro, I've been conducting research that takes a critical historical perspective of this celebratory discourse. And through this work, I revealed that yes, we might very well be in a boom time, but we have been here we've been here many, many times before, every single decade, in fact. So the goal of my work there is taking this critical historical approach. It's not to discredit what's going on or just to be the Debbie Downer at a party, but to actually illuminate some blind spots that keep social systems intact and make seeing how to change them so difficult. So while I was hearing that we're witnessing amazing progress towards gender equality in sport, the actual evidence for me wasn't really stacking up in terms of a progress. Particularly when I look and comparing the contemporary moment with the late 80s and early 90s in the Australian context. But the issue for me really during this time, during this boom time, it has actually been very difficult to ask critical questions about women's sport. As I mentioned, I'm the Debbie Downer at the party. There really hasn't been a lot of space for a critical voice. So what COVID has actually meant for me is that I've been actually given that space a little bit more. So the article that Madeline was talking about that's been published has started to get a little bit more traction. People are listening a little bit more to me in terms of what I would call the facade of progress. So I think because it's come crashing down for a lot of people, those blind spots that we might not have been able to see, we can see now. So that we can see that those changes toward gender equality were perhaps not as stable as we thought. And so for me, in that sense, COVID has actually provided a really good opportunity because it's allowed that critical voice to come at a very, very significant moment. So yeah, I think even though I have a lot more I could say about that, but I think that for me is allowing that critical voice during this time is actually a positive thing.
Thanks, Fee. And actually, I mean, Holly, that sort of reminds me of what you mentioned as we were sort of preparing for this about the challenges of doing feminist research in this moment. And I don't know if you want to link that into your response to this question, but I'll pass it over to you in case in case Fee's interventions are something you can build on.
Hi. Okay, so I might save that for later, Maddie, if that's all right. I think we're kind of building some momentum around the topic rather than the approach in terms of research. But I think I'm seeing similar things here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, from what Fiona's been documenting in Australia. We've had what I would say a relentless positivity in how New Zealand's doing so well at responding to COVID's impacts on women's sport. There's a lot of visibility. There's been a lot of investment in women's sport over the last couple of years. We're hosting the IWG in 2022. We've got a Minister of Sport and Finance who is very focused on women's sport, Grant Robertson. We've got quite a focus in this area, and I'm less optimistic. Maybe it's the critical sociologist in me. We're seeing a lot of rhetoric, but I'm not seeing the economic stimulus and investment that has been invested in sport in Aotearoa in terms of the three different stages. There's been $83 million from the budget over the next 4 years in short-term support to help sports organisations through the initial impact. It's another $104 million towards more medium-term new models and new modes of collaboration in sport at local, regional, national levels. Another $78 million being invested in more innovative approaches to modernise the sector in New Zealand. So we've had some good support, but we're not seeing a gendered approach to that investment. And as I mentioned before, women are being impacted differently. Women make up the majority of volunteer roles in sport, of lowly paid and unpaid roles in sport. And our athletes are being unfairly disadvantaged in this moment. Our rugby sevens team, for example, current world champions, they lost all of their funding and their support structures, while the men's team continued to maintain their funding and are now competing again. And despite these inequalities and the economic sort of decisions that are being made at the national levels, I'm not seeing a lot of female athletes talking out about this. There is this relentless positivity on social media. They're making the best of it. So I'm a little bit concerned that they don't have the space for their voices, their critical voices, to point out these inequalities. And I think this is complicated in New Zealand because of this current moment where we are trying to tell the world how well we're doing at investing in women's sport. And I'm not seeing that from my perspective quite as much as the rhetoric is saying.
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, I feel like in my own work discussing the COVID, the impact of COVID on women's sport, I've also been sometimes hesitant to be too critical, just from the point of view of it ending up being a self-fulfilling prophecy, and maybe there are positive pieces that need to be held up. Then that's a tension for me. And I wonder if Nicole, given your more optimistic response earlier, what you might have to say in response to that second question.
Yes, I do want to say that despite my optimistic comments, that it's not that I disagree with the more critical assessment, but I think the key here, and I knew that my colleagues would perhaps take a more critical approach, because that's what we do. I think it's both and. I think we need to be critical feminist scholars and look for, hope and optimism in terms of action. And Holly, I think you bring out that really good point, is that what I'm really tired of is this lip service around progress and momentum and a tipping point for women's sport and the year of the woman. And then the actions don't follow that up. And I think that's where we need to be vigilant, because the pandemic has really exposed, to Fiona's comments, it's exposed the historic inequities and ways in which female athletes and women's teams, as well as their experiences and opinions, have been pushed aside in favor of male athletes and programs and team priorities. So I think in this moment of this both and is that our work is even more relevant than ever when we position it, because what it's revealed is that feminist scholarship can be used to challenge and disrupt the normative gender ways of managing and organizing sport. And that it's our job to speak truth to power by calling out sexism and male dominance and pushing those in power that we work with sport organizations and NGBs and women's sport around the globe to put some action behind their lip service. And I think we now have this opportunity to do so.
Thanks, Nicole. And Cheryl, can I ask you to share your thoughts on this question of what we've learned about where women's sport is at and how much progress has been made in recent years? Sure.
So I think kind of feeding off some things that are coming up in the conversation, I'm reminded of some of Sarah Ahmed's work in the feminist killjoy. And I wasn't prepared to talk about her work and that concept of the feminist killjoy. So I just want to maybe put like a little pin on that and assert that I am kind of taking on that positionality, which is really sort of, I think, kind of problematizing or at least pushing the sort of dichotomization of optimism and pessimism or hope and critique, that those, I think, sort of echoing some of the things that Nicole was saying, right, that this isn't sort of an either or proposition, but that it is in the critique itself that produces productive and positive social change around equality and equity. So I'm going to embrace my feminist killjoy here, and maybe Fiona, I think it's okay for us to what did you say, be Debbie Downer? I lost you in my screen of people, Fiona, but I think she said Debbie Downer, a feminist killjoy, and that's all right. So having prefaced that, though, I think, and echoing some of the things that I think Fiona has said as well, with respect to progress, as well as some of the issues that people had brought up before around this kind of momentum that we've seen in other spaces. I think we've seen that in the United States as well, that leading up to the pandemic, there was quite a number of news media articles, sport industry reports, as well as scholars who are writing about this momentum in sports. And this has sort of been over the last few years. And this is particularly with respect to, and Nicole had mentioned this earlier, the increase in fans and viewers of women's sports, the increases in sponsorship, corporate sponsorships of women's sports, endorsements for sportswomen and women athletes, the gender parity that we saw in the United States with respect to broadcast coverage of the Winter Olympics. And many sports journalists were talking about this, the 2010s, as being a real transformative decade for women's sports. And my colleague, Dunya Antunjevic, and I are currently working on a book manuscript for Peter Lang that looks at the articulations of feminism in sport media. And this is sort of still a work in progress, but one of the patterns that we are observing in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic is how some of the narratives, the media narratives, quickly shifted from the sort of momentum or transformative moment to the concerns of the impact on women's sports. And for example, the New York Times stated that the coronavirus, and I quote, "the coronavirus compounds financial concerns in women's sports." Several articles suggested that progress in women's sports was paused by the coronavirus. Sports Illustrated talked about how women are receiving lower salaries and fewer sponsorship opportunities, and noted their own concerns and worries about their financial well-being and the future of their sport, particularly when they're only receiving prize money in terms of when they compete and relying on Olympic sponsors. And absence of that, it creates a real void in terms of their earning potential, right? I'm scrolling through some things here that I wanted to highlight as well. So I think what's interesting to see is that some of the narratives that are coming out in the sport media are really, addressing and exposing these gender inequalities, and that's important to do so. But in some ways, some of these narratives are perpetuating this idea of women's sports as being at risk, even in a moment where there was this so-called momentum. And so really sort of, I think, illustrating that precarity. I think what's important to also note here, though, is the kind of pushback from women's sports advocates, those in women's sports organizations, advocacy groups, as well as scholars against some of those narratives. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the book, so stay tuned. And certainly, I think, echoing some of the things that Fiona was saying, one of the things that Mike Messner and I talk about in our book that we wrote a few years ago about the unevenness of social change is just the notion of progress itself, right? And I think Fiona mentioned this, that the kind of conventional wisdom around progress is one of that kind of assumes a linear and progressive movement from inequality towards equality, or lack of opportunity to opportunity, or constraint in participation to expansion in participation, lack of coverage to increased coverage, and so on. So if we think about the historical and contemporary context of women's sports, right, certainly progress towards equality or equity has been historically uneven. It's been contested, it's nonlinear. Progress is often accompanied simultaneously with backlash, with misogyny, with regression, resistance. And so having said all of that, I think in thinking about what progress looks like in this current moment in the United States, certainly the pandemic is revealing both the precarity and vulnerability in women's sports, its continued status as second class within the United States context in particular, but also I think as well as the strength of sportswomen, and particularly the number of women athletes in the United States who are amplifying and engaging in social justice and social activism, as well as the overall resilience of girls and women in this sports space, I think, as some of my other panelists have echoed. Or I should say mentioned. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. So we had just one more question to put to the four panelists before we can then field questions from the audience using the group chat box. And it's a double-barreled question. And the question is, so what will COVID-19 mean for the future of women's sport? And what might sports governing bodies and other sports organisations do differently, or do in this moment, to ensure that the current crisis transforms sport for the better? And I might ask Nicole if it would be really great to start by hearing your perspective on this, given your extensive experience with policy making and governing bodies.
Great, thank you. Happy to lead off the conversation. I think to answer the first part of the question, what does COVID mean for the future of women's sport? I've been asked that question a lot lately, and I'm going to maybe take a little bit of an easy out. I think it's too early to tell. I think it could go multiple different ways, and I think, to use the old cliche, time will tell. It could reinforce gendered inequality and inequities, or it could be a moment of opportunity. I'm not sure. I'm on the fence on that one. But what can we do differently to help maximize the likelihood that we will use it as a positive opportunity for social change? I'll just offer a couple comments. First of all, is that when we emerge, hopefully we can emerge with a foot forward. That we, and I'm inviting everybody into this conversation to think about what can you do to enact social change in whatever way you can. It doesn't have to just be those in power. Change can also start from the ground up, and we've seen that with the WNBA. But when we're looking about reallocating resources and what the new normal might look like, is that we need to put designing for equity at the forefront of decision making. with a focus on access that is safe, easy, minimal cost, opportunity rich, and provides connection, especially at the community level, which is where most of us live and reside. So that's number one, with a focus on designing for equity. I think two is that properties, sport organizations, governing bodies that have an authentic focus on equity, not just lip service, that their focus cannot be framed or motivated by inauthentic revenue generation capitalistic logic. Consumers are way too savvy, and it will not work or be sustainable, and in fact it might backfire. So the key here is that sport leaders need to employ, leverage, and listen to the diverse populations that they serve. And I think lastly, because women have been disproportionately impacted and the pandemic's further exposed the invisible labor of caretaking and increased workloads for women, that sport organizations really need to challenge their policies of how they support and value women in male-dominated spaces and industries in sport, because there's two kind of strongly held ideologies that support this workplace status quo of 24/7 access, 60+ hour work weeks that really disadvantage women. Is that one, long work hours are necessary, and two, it stalls women's advancement, and that's sort of inevitable. So both of those are false, but we need policies that support and value women, parents that have a healthy balance. And this is going to be a business imperative as we move forward, because I just saw on Twitter a stat come through yesterday that in September in the US, close to 900,000 US women left the workforce. That's nearly 1 million women that left the workforce because of COVID and juggling domestic labor, childcare, workplace, life. That falls on women, and that is going to hurt our economy and our democracy if we don't address this issue. So centering sort of an ethic of care deliberately and unapologetically of doing what's good and right for everybody, not just the privileged few, I think is really, really important, and especially for those that are underserved. So those are sort of my three key call to action moving forward.
Thanks, Nicole. And Holly, you also talked about communities of care. I might throw it over to you to hear your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, thank you. I think expected response from me might be that sports organisations need to take a feminist approach and rethinking their investment strategies. I think I could easily draw upon Naomi Klein's work on disaster capitalism. We could think about COVID as a disaster for women's sport, or sport more broadly, and what we're seeing is those earlier dominant structures being reinforced. So we need to push back on that. Sure, that would probably be what people would expect me to say, but I actually want to reframe that question and maybe think, what is this future that we speak of? It's coming through so strongly in that second project I mentioned. The women are really struggling to imagine a future. We have to think very short term because the world is so uncertain and unstable. So I think we need to this is a moment to rethink, what is this future? Is it a future of continued capitalism, overconsumption, neoliberalism, environmental destruction, exploitation, extreme inequalities of both humans and non-humans? Or can we use this opportunity to imagine different types of futures for ourselves? And I would encourage sports organisations to radically reconsider alternative models of sport that are based on local communities, are about physical activity and participation rather than competition and consumption. And I know this might sound extreme for a lot of people out there, but I think sport as we know it has always been based on unequal structures of power. And maybe rather than trying to patch it up, we need to use COVID to prompt new types of questions. And over the last months and years, I've been working with Marianne Clark, Julie Bryce, Alison Jeffrey, and as I mentioned before, more recently Adele Pavlidis and Simone Fulliger, and we've been using feminist new materialisms to rethink how we know sporting and physical cultural phenomena. And I think this is an important opportunity to embrace the possibilities of new theoretical and methodological approaches that help us respond to the radically new conditions of our lives. Is sport, as we have known it, really what the world needs more of in the Anthropocene? So I think, we need to, I would encourage rethinking how we've known sport. And I also think one thing that COVID has taught us is that we can live without competitive, elite, mega sporting events. We can live without that. And actually what's most important is local forms of physical activity and connection through movement and connecting with our outdoor environments and with people. So maybe some of those ideas on the table for sports organisations would be valuable. But I also think COVID has shown us that women are not a homogenous group. COVID has impacted women around the world in wildly different ways. And this brings me back to Bray Dottie, whose work's really sparking for me, and her affirmative ethics, where she says, we are not one and the same, but we are in this convergence together. And there's a quote that I love from her, and I read it in my mind always through thinking about women in sport, and I'm going to read it now if I can, to explore some of these gendered effects of pandemic. And she says, what is inexhaustible is our desire to persevere in living against all odds. The desire to get on with it is the fragile yet irrepressible bond that connects all living entities. What is inexhaustible is our capacity, our power even, to differ within ourselves as well as between us. We can extract ourselves from the sad state of affairs, work through the multiple layers of our own exhaustion, and co-construct different platforms of becoming. Shared exhaustion actually unfolds upon a deeper wisdom about what it is exactly that one knows when one is facing momentous changes in unfamiliar territories. And I think if we can work reflexively and ethically from this moment of shared exhaustion and the multiplicities of difference, we can start to imagine radically new becomings for women's sport. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly. Really powerful excerpt to have chosen. Thanks so much for sharing that. And also really important what you emphasized about the when we're talking about women's sport or gender equity, gender equity for which women or sport for which women, and how do we want to rethink maybe feminist goals when it comes to sport, or make those more articulate or more sensitive to that intersectionality. And Cheryl, I know that you emphasise the intersections with the racial justice movement in the US context in particular. Could I ask you to share your thoughts on this question of future, what now for women's sport, and also what might sports governing bodies and other organisations do differently?
Of course, yeah. I think I'm going to probably riff off of some of what Holly said, and I really appreciate how both Holly and Nicole are kind of sort of playing with the question and tweaking it. And I always get these questions, and I think to myself, like, what can we do to get rid of sexism in sport, or what can we do to make the world a better place? And I'm always like, oh God, like that's the $1 million question, right? What does the future look like? Or, some of these sort of forward thinking questions. And, I don't know, Holly, I hate to sort of follow you in some ways, although I'm thinking very, in some ways similar, but also maybe a bit more, I don't know. I hate to use it, the kind of positive and negative, right? But I think for me, and I think for a lot of people across the globe, the pandemic really provided important opportunities for us to rethink, reimagine, and re-envision our societies, in particular our sports. As Holly, I think, so eloquently spoke about, and In the United States context, I think at the beginning, there were a lot of experts and scholars who were coming out and suggesting that this might actually be the end of sports as we know it. I listened to a couple of sport media podcasts where, the sport punditry was sort of questioning what does sport look like in the future? What will sport be? Will there be sport? What does sport media look like in this future? There were predictions of a reckoning in the world of sports, in particular in the world of college sports, professional sports, and sport media. I think, Holly, you mentioned something, and I wrote it down because you'd said that, if I heard you correctly, you said we can live without mega sports events is what the pandemic has taught us. I would say that for a good segment of the US population, the pandemic has taught us the exact opposite, which is that we cannot live without our mega sports events. And we heard that sort of echoed in different spaces. And I think we see that with respect to some of the changes, the rapid changes that have happened on the ground. And so certainly the relationships between sport, media, and corporations were put under strain at the immediate start of the pandemic. And it was really uncertain whether the sport media complex would buckle or bounce back. And in many cases, rather than reimagining or re-envisioning what sports would look like, most sport organizations here in the US found ways to manage the pandemic in an attempt to return to the way things were. The potential for a new normal in the world of sports was addressed by consulting the way things have always been done in order to return to the way things were. I think this is seen and evidenced in the incredible efforts that universities and colleges, as well as professional sports leagues here in the United States have taken on to navigate the pandemic, oftentimes despite or in spite of medical experts and CDC guidance who have cautioned against the safety of resuming play at this particular moment. The economic resources that have been invested in establishing and maintaining the bubble in professional sports were indicative of the lengths that professional leagues would go to ensure that there was no disruption in play, or at least to minimize or shorten the disruption that did happen, and therefore having no real impact on the bottom line or trying to mitigate the impact on the bottom line. The COVID testing protocols for college football in the United States far exceed what's offered for the general student population and illustrate the lengths that sports organizations and institutions will go to ensure that the pandemic does not stop the revenue generating potential of these sports, which in the United States typically are men's sports. And so I think I'm at least seeing right now this real dramatic shift in the United States from this sort of potential and the conversations that were happening about rethinking professional sports or rethinking collegiate sports. Some of those conversations that were happening in March and April really were silenced or marginalized or maybe overtaken by some of these other conversations about how do we get back to sports. And what's interesting in these conversations, and maybe Nicole, you might be able to speak to this and you might have a different take or a similar take, is that the real emphasis is how do we get college football players back on the field? How do we get men's basketball back on the court? Maybe to a certain extent, women's basketball. But it's really about getting those quote unquote revenue generating sports back at play to sort of return to the way things were, instead of what I was suggesting to a journalist that I was speaking to is maybe this means that sports at the collegiate level, at least, are no longer commercialized to the extent that they were. And now I feel silly even saying that might be a possibility. The other thing that I wanted to add to this conversation, and I think the Tucker Center probably has some of their own resources and information in this space. I also work with the Women's Sports Foundation, and they have the Keep Playing hashtag and their initiative and a COVID action plan that's been posted on their website, which offers players, coaches, parents, and schools and communities with specific recommendations to address the decrease in opportunities in sports that we've seen across the board boys and girls sports, but specifically girls being and women being more affected than boys and men. And I think the United Nations or the UN Women report on COVID is another really interesting resource that outlines some of the challenges that girls and women are facing globally with respect to access to participation and how the constraints that they're experiencing in their everyday lives. Nicole mentioned, the kind of constraints on, so balancing workplace demands with the realities of the pandemic and how our work life has shifted. Certainly there's other ways that we've seen constraints manifest across other contexts and spaces. And so I would encourage folks to maybe look to those resources to see what others are saying about recommendations with respect to how do we navigate the pandemic and how do we ensure that girls and women have access to opportunities and have access to quality participation opportunities in spite of the constraints they face that they face that have been now exacerbated as a result of this pandemic.
Thanks, Cheryl. I feel like we need to collate all of these resources somewhere, because what you mentioned about the Women's Sports Foundation sounds like a really terrific resource, and I bet there are others that we could pull together. Fiona, I know you've thought a lot about this question of what might be done differently in this moment. So could I ask you to sort of round out our formal panel discussion?
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. And I had planned, in terms of answering this question, to be a bit hopeful. So I hope that I have embodied that feminist killjoy that has been bandied about a little bit. And I absolutely remain optimistic. I think I'm even more optimistic because of the big shake-up. So in the historical work, it looks like there's boom, 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 and an underlying bust that's quite subtle. This is a big bust, not to trigger any negative memories for Holly, but in terms of an earthquake kind of thing, where we can rebuild. What Nicole was talking about, designing for equity, is fantastic kind of concept there, and I really am hopeful of that. And I did see that Jay Coakley was in the audience, and I don't want to for him to think poorly of me, but I am a bit of a sport evangelist in a lot of ways as well. So I really believe I actually do believe in the power of sport. I've had incredible experiences, and I know a lot of the people that we work with are so passionate, and they just want to get back, particularly our Football Victoria project. They want to get back to their clubs, and they want to ensure that for boys and men as well as girls and women, that we are able to enjoy those physical experiences in those social settings. And we know they're not perfect. As we know, I'm very critical of a lot of what goes on, but I couldn't imagine my life without sport. And I think that this is a fantastic opportunity. Earlier this week in Australia, we had the budget was released quite a few months later than it normally would be. And similar to what the other speakers have been talking about in terms of the economic impacts for women of COVID, the budget really didn't speak to those gaps at all. So it's been labelled the blue budget for a pink recession, and that's quite depressing. But in the budget reply, the Labor leader talked about this being a once-in-a-generation opportunity in terms of rethinking how we might do something, and I agree with that in terms of sport. Maddie and I talked about in the paper she's mentioned about a reconceptualising a model of interdependence, and I think that's, Maddie, perhaps just a really simple way of explaining what Holly was talking about in terms of Braidotti's work and the being in it together. So rather than thinking of separate realms of us and them, perhaps we reconsider that perhaps the male side of sport can also not just lend one way, but perhaps we can reconfigure the unequal landscape and co-create different settings in terms of maintaining the cultural prominence of sport, but potentially in more equal ways. So I am really seeing this as an opportunity. I go think creatively about some of the ways that we organise sport. And I go back to what I'm trying to get across in the opening statement around girls and women's time is political, and it's not prioritised to the extent of boys and men. And so some of the creative things we could be thinking about in terms of time. So we've spent a lot of time, a lot of work's gone into trying to open up space for women in sport and physical activity, but I think it's really important to think about time as well. So in terms of time, again, I'm going to just point to one other study. Honours student Alana Richardson, fantastic emerging scholar. Write her name down, you will come across her in years to come. She's conducting research into the experiences of women playing club level Australian rules football, where we have seen an increase in participation numbers in the last few years. And she says within the COVID moment, there was a small slice of time there where the women got together and they were able to train. There wasn't a competition, but the lockdown eased and they were able to go back to training, and training without the pressure of competition and without contact gave those women a chance to go back to basics and learn skills. This was something most people missed, as the initial training was very rushed. And in the interviews she conducted, people commented on the vast improvement in their skills over that time. And also in the lockdown, for those women, it might actually have solidified how important playing football or sport is for their social, physical and mental health. So within that setting, and I'm thinking about time here, giving girls and women the time to learn skills, to be physically competent in a way that boys and men are allowed to do in incidental time. Right, so ensuring that time is there to develop skills, to be good, to actually get the most out of those physical settings and also the social settings as well. There was also one other thing, and this is like a bit out there, but thinking about caregiving, because I know that has been one of the main concerns and something that's been really exposed during this time. And a lot of some of the work we've been doing with barriers to women's participation in physical activity in Melbourne's West. All of the women talk about how they need caregiving facilities in sports to be able to participate. And I just wondered whether this is an opportunity to really rethink that idea, and perhaps it's that we need the caregiving at the men's activities, so that this then gives women time and space to choose how they might spend their time without those responsibilities. So rather than always attaching those ideas to men's activities, we could think about or rethink how we do that. So those were just a couple of my final observations or crazy, wacky ideas. But again, thanks very much to everyone. Amazing responses, and I've learned a lot from the other panelists. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Fiona. And I'm aware that we are actually over time. We had allotted 75 minutes. I want to be respectful also of our panelists' time. I don't know that we have time to answer it, but I did just want to share one question that came to me from Andrew Meyer, who had a question for the panel. He asked, has the COVID-19 moment changed or challenged your own academic perspective and approach to the study of women in sport? That was a question from Andrew. And there've been several other. There's been a back and forth in the chat box in relation to media coverage of sport during the lockdown in particular, and research that's happening around that. So thanks for everyone who's contributed to that. But as much as I would love to hear all of your responses to Andrew's question and field some more, I think perhaps, Lucy, what do you think? I think to be respectful of people's time, we're already over, so perhaps we might wrap it up. What do you think? Okay, I think she's giving me the. So thank you everyone for making the time to join us. Thanks for persevering during rude interruptions and my apologies especially to our panelists for having to endure that. I certainly didn't anticipate that, and perhaps I should have. But thank you so much for your really generous and very carefully thought through responses. I can tell that this is a topic that you've given a lot of time and thought to over recent months. And I hope everyone has enjoyed hearing from your expertise. Please make sure, actually, can we just do a round of applause, and if you can use your reactions. I know I can't unmute you all, but we can simulate it. Thank you, everyone. Please check out the ISSA schedule. This is just the first panel for the conference, so there are many more that you are going to be able to join if you have the time. Thanks, everybody. Take good care.